Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Whip Union, and in this one, the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of Chasiv Yar, in the western flank of Toretsk, in the direction of Pokrovsk, to the southwest of Pokrovsk, and in the southern flank of Kurakhove, in the direction of Konstantinopel. Starting out in the southern direction, the Russians have started an advance towards Konstantinopel, aligning the front line along the canal that is built between Sukhyali River and down to the western direction and connecting up further north. With this, the Russians are now moving onwards towards Constantinople and have reached the outskirts of it from the eastern and from the southern direction. At the same time, the Russians have managed to advance northeast of Selenivka in the direction of the rear of Dashne and Ulakli, where they are expanding along the roads and forest lines towards the highway between Kurakhove and Constantinople, where the Russians are fighting over Dashne in the eastern direction, have control of the Vovcha River in the northern direction, and are now advancing from the southern direction along the forest lines and roads towards Ulakli and the fortified position in the western direction. At the same time, they are attempting to expand their control in the north of Yantarne to connect with the Dashne section of the front line. Fighting over Constantinople will significantly weaken the Ukrainian positions around Ulakli and Dashne, as no more reinforcements and supplies will be able to go through Constantinople and into the pocket between the Vovcha and Sukhyali river lines. This will mean that the Russians will speed up the offensive operations in this pocket to gain full control of it, and then push onwards towards Andrivka and Constantinople from this direction. At the same time, the Russians also expanded in the direction of Rostov recently. This means that the Russians will also likely launch offensive operations to gain control over the town and then along the highway towards Bahatir. As we're already seeing offensive operations from the southern direction, the Russians will do a pincer maneuver from the east and from the south. You'll see that the Russians are continuing offensive operations here to the west of Kurakhove to reach the Dnipropetrovsk region and to gain control over these pockets that are being formed to the west of the city. Russians managed to gain control of the southern parts of Nadiivka, as we see with this geolocated footage. This allows Russians to gain control over a larger portion of the area and slowly move towards a military base just west of Nadiivka, gain control over that as well, to then push alongside the fortified positions in the northern flank and along the main road towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. Nadiivka acts as an outpost, as there are hardly other areas near it except for the fortified positions and military base to the west of it. Following that, there's Kotlyarivka, which also acts as an outpost, a few fields to the west, and along the area to the northwest, the Russians will eventually reach Muravka along the Soluna River. The objective of the Russians will be able to move through the forest lines and the fortified positions up towards the Soluna River, where their objective is to move alongside it towards the Dnipropetrovsk region and connect with the southern direction through Nadiivka and the fortified positions, and in the northern flank through Dashne, gain control of that, move towards Molotsk along the border area, and then support the forces in the main section, which is along the Soluna River, where the Ukrainians have the strongest forces present. The Ukrainians also attempted to launch some counterattacks around the Udashne area to try and prevent a Russian capture of Udashne and the coal mine to the north of it, to prevent the Russians from having a strong flank west of Pokrovsk, which will allow them to start operations towards the city itself. Until the Russians gain control over Udashne and the coal mine, it is unlikely that they will look to gain a foothold within Pokrovsk itself from the western direction. The Russians have, however, expanded their zone of control north of Shevchenko, gaining control over several fortified positions and forest lines along the railways here in the northern direction. This leaves only a few fortified positions between the Russian positions and the city of Pokrovsk itself from the southern direction, gaining full control over the first line of defense north of Shevchenko and moving on to the second line of defense just north of it. And with the fighting within Svirove, the Russians are already within the urban area of Pokrovsk itself, as they're moving through the villages ahead of the city itself, but connected with it, from which the Russians can enter into the southern outskirts and western outskirts of Pokrovsk. The Russians with these advances also move along the railways towards Novoukrayinka and upwards towards the settlements to the southeast of the city of Pokrovsk. This allowed the Russians to flank the town of Lysivka, the northern parts of it, and Chasiv Yar, and attempts to connect the two sides by moving along the railways from the eastern and western directions to bypass fortified positions north of Chasiv and Chasiv Yar and move into the eastern parts of the residential area of Pokrovsk, which is near the most well-fortified area, which is the apartment complex area in the southern parts of the city. The city of Pokrovsk itself will face a siege that will be focused around the supply lines outside of the city itself. As for within the city itself, there's the apartment complex area in the southern parts, which will be the main area of resistance for the Ukrainians. Then there's the railway area in the central parts, and some parts here and there throughout the city where the Ukrainians have set up defensive positions. But the main efforts will be in the southern parts, which is filled with apartment complex areas that overlook fortified zones and fortified areas to the south of the city, which prevents a Russian foothold within the city itself from being achieved. And this is why the Russian main focus is on the flanks rather than directly head on, as Russians would prefer to attack the supply lines and enter from a alternate angle than storming a city with apartment complex areas and several lines of defense, having to move through open fields to get to the city. In the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to flank the fortified positions in the southwest of Toretsk and gain control over the southern parts of Chervenivka all the way to the eastern outskirts, as we see with this geolocated footage here. The Russians are here pushing towards the flank of the fortified positions with a control over the northern outskirts and now the western outskirts. The Ukrainian forces here in the fortified area to the southwest of Toretsk are now completely encircled with no road in or out, and they have to move through some open fields to get out, which will be within firing range of every Russian position in the outskirts of Chervenivka and the outskirts of Toretsk. This means that they'll be attacked from both sides from direct fire, and therefore it is unlikely that even a single Ukrainian soldier will be able to withdraw and escape from this pocket. Therefore, either the Ukrainians will have to launch a counterattack to free up their encirclement, or they will have to attempt a withdrawal through direct fire, which is unlikely to succeed for anyone. And in the end, they have the alternative to either make a last stand or to surrender. Now, I received a comment a couple of days ago talking about how all of these encirclements are actually a tactic, a strategy of the Ukrainian forces to slow down the Russian forces as much as possible, expending lives to buy time. This allowed the Ukrainians to build new fortified lines that will then allow them to expend lives to buy time, and eventually with enough time Ukraine will be able to turn the situation around. And I'll just be saying, they have had plenty of time. It's been almost 3 years since the war began, and situation today is at the worst point since summer of 2022. And it doesn't seem like it is improving. Instead, US aid to Ukraine has stopped. The Ukrainians are struggling to mobilize anymore, so they're debating setting their mobilization age down to 18, and so much more that is significantly worse than it were at summer of 2022. So time isn't really what the Ukrainians need right now. Rather than time, it is saving the manpower and negotiating a deal. And that is simply not how they do by losing group of manpower after group of manpower when they're already short on them. Therefore, my conclusion is this territorial gain that the Russians will gain from this is less significant than the amount of soldiers that is going to be lost during this. Therefore, if this is a tactic deliberate by the Ukrainians to slow down the Russians, then it is a miscalculation because they are suffering more from it than what they're gaining from it. Finally, in the Chasiv Yar direction, we're seeing that the Russians are gaining control of several more fortified positions in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar, and the endgame of the city has begun when the Russians are now constantly storming the southern outskirts of the city, which is the final remaining parts beside the apartment complex area in the central parts and the last remaining parts in the northern outskirts. The Ukrainians barely hold anything left within the city of Chasiv Yar, and the Russians have control of the majority of it by now. And this means that generally what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are reportedly attempting counterattacks to reverse the situation while the Russians continue to make gains along the fortified positions and the forest patch areas of the city, which will lead to the Russians gaining a significant advantage within it and moving on to the outskirts of the city to then fight over Mykolaiivka, Chervones, Tupushki, and so on, beyond that of Chasiv Yar, and the fighting will also reach the firing positions to the northwest of Chasiv Yar and the high ground along the canal lines, which will allow the Russians to significantly strengthen their positions across the canal area and in the general area where the Russians will now be overlooking the entire area. And the advantages this brings to the Russians is a significant improving of the situation, not just from the Chasiv Yar direction, but the entire area towards the Severodonetsk River in the northern flank, towards the siege of Konstantinivka to gain control of the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, pushing to the western flank of Pokrovsk. All of this will be easier for the Russians to do from the capture of Chasiv Yar. That is just how significant the Battle of Chasiv Yar is. It will significantly change the situation within this entire section of the front line. And that is due to the fact that if the Russians gain control of the high ground, they'll be able to gain significant artillery support for their forces in a circle around Chasiv Yar. And due to that, they'll be able to concentrate the forces in this direction, and this will free up forces in other directions, which were used to make up for the lack of geographical advantages, and this will allow the Russians to then spread out their forces into areas that would need more reinforcements. Also allow the Russians to hit the supply lines of the Ukrainian forces, take advantage of this high ground to gain control over areas that are on a lower elevation, and from there they'll be able to strengthen the positions in other sections of the front line as well. So there are multiple layers of advantages that are given to the Russian forces with the capture of Chasiv Yar. It is even more significant than the capture of Bakhmut or even Avdiivka. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.